Welcome to this module of the Tennessee Smart Yards program. I'm Andrea Ludwig, and I am the Stormwater Management Specialist for the University of Tennessee Extension and an Associate Professor in the Biosystems Engineering and Soil Science Department at UT. The topic for this module is reducing stormwater runoff and pollutants. This is one of the 9 foundational principles towards a Tennessee Smart Yard. The other principles include right plant, right place, water efficiently, fertilize appropriately, manage soils and mulch, provide for wildlife, manage yard pests, reduce, reuse, recycle, and protecting water's edge. So each of these 9 principles has a set of associated stewardship actions that can be easily adopted in your landscape. And once you have selected the actions that make sense for you and your own personal landscaping goals and how you choose to practice stewardship in your landscape, once you have accumulated 36 inches worth of actions, you can certify your yard as a Tennessee Smart Yard. So let's get started on our topic today. And we can't start talking about stormwater runoff without first talking about precipitation, because this is where it all starts. So here we have a map of Tennessee, and this is showing us the distribution of the average annual precipitation across our state. And given that the national average is 30 inches, we can see that from Mountain City to Memphis, Tennessee gets a lot of rain because all regions of Tennessee are well above that 30-inch mark. So this means that there's a lot of opportunity for us to utilize that rainfall in our landscape. But there's also a lot of opportunity for challenges and risks associated to a lot of water in the landscape. And partner all this water falling from the sky with land use changes, and we have a recipe for some of those challenges being seen throughout the landscape. So let's take a look at what that landscape change might look like. And here we're using Google Earth to look at the landscape from above, just the way a raindrop would see it. And we're using the historical toolbar, so you can see in the upper left-hand corner, we've rolled back the clock to the year 2002. And when we look at the landscape here, we see a lot of green, a lot of vegetation, and we can imagine when it rains in this landscape that there's a lot of opportunity for that water to be intercepted by vegetation and soak into the landscape through infiltration and get into the soils and be utilized by that vegetation in the landscape. So I'm going to fast forward the clock here, and we're going to look at what are some of the challenges in terms of water movement in the landscape once this landscape has changed into a residential development. So here we see a lot of that green color being replaced with more grays and browns. And so of course that means that we have more impervious surfaces like rooftops and pavement. And just knowing the amount of compaction and grade work and soil manipulation that has to happen in the landscape to build these structures, we can also safely assume that our soils aren't as spongy either. So given those changes in the landscape and the qualities of the landscape, when it rains in this new land cover, it presents a lot of challenges because we have water in different spaces in the landscape. It's not allowed to absorb into the soil, into the landscape like it was in that previous picture. Presenting some challenges, not only to us as individual homeowners, so we might see more soil compaction leading to nuisance ponding and more runoff being produced in our landscape, which affects the way that we can use that space, affects the way that we can manage that space. But then also all of those compound to present community challenges at a larger scale. So here in this picture, we have a parking lot that is conveniently placed next to the store, but also inconveniently in the floodplain of this creek. And just one example of what one of those challenges at a watershed or community scale might be is that we have a lot of eroded sediment, eroded soil that's deposited sediment into this parking lot, and it presents a challenge to these business owners, to the community members that want to utilize the space, and then also to our public infrastructure and our public resources. We now have to expend time and effort and resources in remediating this issue. So a lot of different challenges to us as individual property owners, and then to our communities and our public infrastructure, due to the way water is now moving through the landscape in a changed hydrology in developing watersheds. So let's talk a little bit about what your local backyard water cycle looks like. Like we talked about, having vegetation in the landscape does a lot to intercept some of that rainfall that falls, and then soak it up after that water has been able to infiltrate into the soils, allowing for a more natural water process to happen. When we look at our infrastructure in our home landscape, we actually have two different water cycles going on. Here, where we have water that comes into our home landscape through our plumbing and leaves through our plumbing, this water actually travels through the sanitary sewer system to a wastewater treatment plant. And so that is kind of one piece of that water cycle that is separate than the stormwater cycle. So water that drains from the landscape from these impervious surfaces and makes its way into our storm drainage infrastructure, it is actually directly connected to our local waterways, our creeks, our streams, our rivers, and our reservoirs. So instead of going through a wastewater treatment plant like our sanitary sewer does, this storm sewer infrastructure is actually connected directly to our local waterways, like this creek. This means that there's a lot of potential for substances and pollutants to get into that storm drain system and make its way into our waterways. And some common stormwater pollutants that we would see in our home landscape include sediment and eroded soil. So if we have bare spots in our yards, water that carries a lot of velocity can actually detach that soil and carry it in stormwater runoff, so producing erosion and carrying it into the storm drain system. Also, any trash or debris that's stockpiled in that drainage way has the potential to be carried off. Chemicals like fertilizers or herbicides and pesticides, anything, again, that's kind of in that pathway when it rains has the potential to be picked up and transported with that runoff. And even something as simple as washing our car. Our driveways are often connected and downhill from our roadways, and that roadway acts as a collection system for that storm drain system. So any of the soaps and cleansers and chemicals that we use on our cars, and anything that's getting washed off of our cars, again, has that potential to be washed into the storm drain. So what can we do to take action and practice stewardship towards reducing stormwater runoff and these pollutants in our home landscape? So the first step would be to get outside and observe our property and see what our home stormwater flow path network is. And then consider our actions that might help reduce the amount of water leaving our property and any of those pollutants. And then also taking action. So how can we direct, collect, infiltrate that water, get it into the ground, and practice good housekeeping to keep those pollutants, those chemicals out of the stormwater runoff when it happens. So we have an extension publication on our website that actually helps us all see our landscape like a raindrop would see it from above. And so this publication will step you through making a map of your property, differentiating between pervious and impervious surfaces. Here the impervious surfaces are indicated with the dark blue color, and then connecting drainage features and making this stormwater flow network in our property. So connecting our downspouts, seeing where water falls, connecting with arrows, and then seeing how our property is connected with that local storm drain system. And we're looking for things like our downspouts. They go subsurface, and if so, where are they daylighted? Do they connect to a local drainage way? Do they pop up in the middle of your yard? Also looking for things like bare soils. Where do we have the potential for erosion to continue to happen? Do we see signs of existing erosion like this picture is showing us some pedestals? So we see gravel and wood chips. We see signs of erosion under that because they're on the pedestal of soil there. So everything that was around it has been eroded away. And then also just simply looking to see where swirls in mulch and wood chips might be, indicating where some of that stormwater runoff has flowed before. And the best time to see your property in action would be when it's raining. So grabbing your umbrella, getting outside. Oftentimes it's really hard to see the lie of the land or the topography that is influencing the way water is moving through your home landscape. So what best time to see it than when it's actively raining and you can actually see where water is ponding, where it's pooling, where it's flowing, and how it's connecting with any of the surrounding infrastructure. So let's get to some of these actions towards a Tennessee Smart Yard. So here we have our 4 actions that help you get inches towards your Tennessee Smart Yard. So carrying anywhere between values of 2 to 3 inches worth of actions. And our first example is going to be simply disconnecting those downspouts from the stormwater system and directing them into a permeable area. So absorbing that rainfall runoff from your rooftop that's carried in your downspouts, trying to get your downspout to empty into a lawn area or a garden area instead of onto another hard surface. And this will allow that water to soak into the ground instead of accumulating and potentially transporting any pollutants downstream. Some things to keep in mind is that using extensions on your downspouts to get your get that water at least 3 feet away from your home foundation, and making sure you're not directing it into any other infrastructure or your neighbor's infrastructure, and keeping it safely away from anything that could be harmed by this increased water flow. Doing a quick perk test. So just downhill from where your downspout is going to be disconnected, in that area, digging a shallow hole, filling it a few times, and just making sure that that water is indeed going to be able to percolate into the soil will help fight against any nuisance ponding that might happen. And then perhaps hiding that downspout, planting some more plants in that area just to kind of camouflage it, so that you don't have any downspout extensions that are poking out or causing any aesthetic issue for you. And then where does it go after that? So thinking about replacing impermeable surfaces like this concrete drainage path with something that's permeable. So that concrete obviously doesn't allow the water, once it's collected in that drainage path, to infiltrate. It just carries it downstream. If we replace that concrete with something like grass or a permeable surface, then that water is allowed to soak into the soil, nurturing our turf grass here. So here we're working in a pretty low slope environment, and the potential for erosion is pretty low, especially if we can have this established, nice, lush turf coverage right here. So replacing impermeable surfaces with something more permeable like vegetation there. Increasing runoff and increasing our infiltration. And then utilizing swales in your landscape. So cutting off any sheet flow that might be coming off of your landscape, off of your house pad, intercepting that with a very shallow depression in the landscape with a berm on the other side, kind of capturing it and guiding it safely to perhaps a rain garden. But this allows you to again, kind of keep that water on your property and use it to nurture a planted garden bed or your turf grass as well. So getting to rain gardens, that is our next action here. So building a rain garden to catch that stormwater runoff and infiltrate it into the ground will get you 3 inches of actions towards a Tennessee Smart Yard. And so what's a rain garden? A rain garden is simply a planted depression in the landscape that is designed and placed in an area that can capture and infiltrate your runoff. So here we've got an example from our very own West Tennessee Research and Education Center at the UT Gardens there in Jackson. And you can see that this rain garden, newly planted in this picture, is taking runoff from a couple downspouts from that plantation house on the property there, as well as a significant part of the driveway runoff as well. So some quick steps to build a rain garden. First, you'll want to identify where exactly would a rain garden work for you in your landscape, and be able to capture that runoff. So placing it in a place that can actually intercept the runoff before it gets into the storm drain system or onto the roadway. Doing some soil testing, so making sure that we've got soils that will be able to infiltrate that water that's going to be ponded in your rain garden, a very shallow pond. Sizing the garden based on that soil test infiltration capacity, and then putting together a plant plan, picking out materials for any inlets or outlets, and constructing, observing, caring for your rain garden, and then enjoying all the beneficial wildlife that it could bring to your space as well. So just some practical examples here. This is an example from Knoxville, redirecting this stormwater runoff from these two downspouts on the front side of this house into the space that we've delineated with the flagging tape. And previously, these downspouts went into the subsurface and were actually connected with a road drain. You can see that in the picture there. And so we wanted to disconnect those downspouts, guide them into the rain garden, and in this situation the homeowner wanted to continue to have a mown area around the rain garden, so they actually used subsurface pipe and little pop-ups to allow that water to pop up into the middle of the rain garden in that depression, nurturing those native plants planted in the rain garden. And then once the rain garden is full, it'll just take about 1 inch of rainfall for a rain garden to be filled, and then over 1 inch of rainfall, that overflow, that excess, would need to find that overflow there with the flagstone, in this example made out of the flagstone, and be directed safely back into the storm drain system. And here's some more pictures of a rain garden at work. Again, so these systems are going to capture about 1 inch of runoff from your space that drains to it. And then when it rains more than 1 inch and that rain garden is saturated, that overflow will need to safely make its way into that storm drain system as it was before. But if we can capture about 1 inch of rainfall, then believe it or not, we'll actually capture about 80% of that average annual rainfall in much of our state. So the majority of our rainfall actually falls in that 1 inch and lower rain events. So our next example of some practices to inch your way towards a Tennessee Smart Yard, using permeable surfaces for hardscapes, such as driveways, walkways, and patios, because of course we still need these in our landscape, we need them at our homes, but how can we make them more permeable in nature to accept that water when it rains, instead of having impermeable surfaces. So some examples of surfaces that will absorb water instead of create runoff are pervious concrete, plastic porous pavement, porous interlocking paver block systems, and then of course just your standard gravel, aggregate porous surfaces. So all of these are permeable examples of how you might replace these hard surfaces with something that will infiltrate water instead of shed it. To look at some specific examples, here's a paver block system with pavers, permeable pavers. There's a lot of different varieties. They make them in a lot of different colors now. Some of them are interlocking and are meant to be backfilled with some aggregates. So some pea gravel, some washed aggregates. So you can see in this example on the left side of the screen where water hits these pavers, but it's able to seep in between them and into that porous media and into an underlying porous media bed as well. So that water is infiltrated into the ground. And then on the example on the right, here we've got a turf stone that actually is half concrete, but then half planted space. And so you can backfill those cavities in the turf stone with a mixture of sand and topsoil, seed it, and actually grow turf grass in those cavities. So again, when it rains, water is able to find its way into the ground through those planted spaces. So some maintenance tips on this. Sometimes you will have some need to go out and refill some of those spaces in between the interlocking pavers with more pea gravel, or reseed over if you are using a turf application. And then, like I said, your just basic gravel driveway can capture and absorb, a lot of rainfall as it falls on it versus a concrete paved driveway. So thinking about using pea gravel or other aggregates that creates that porous surface, some maintenance considerations, again, would be some periodic additions of gravel as it is washed away or moved during traffic, just raking out any furrows or trenches that might evolve over time, and just making sure that you sometimes frequently remove leaves, twigs, other detritus biomass that comes from the landscape, because that could build up and create drainage problems for you over a long period of time. And so that brings us to our last action here, which is practicing good housekeeping. So we've talked about how we can absorb water into the landscape and choose more permeable options, but then also practicing good housekeeping to make sure that we don't have much opportunity for those pollutants in our home landscape to be transported into the storm drain system and make its way to those water bodies. So to kind of start this topic off, unfortunately, oftentimes our yards are starting off on the wrong foot and with an uphill battle, just because of the amount of soil manipulation that occurs in the landscape often results in really highly compacted soils being left for us to deal with as homeowners. And of course, those compacted soils produces a lot of runoff, and so anything that we are putting out into the landscape, instead of being absorbed into the soil, if it's still compacted and we're dealing with those issues, it is more likely to be carried off in runoff than with a porous kind of topsoil, porous soil. So one of the best ways to practice good housekeeping is to ensure that any exposed soils, if we can get vegetation growing on them to reduce the impacts of rainfall on bare soils, to cover it, to get some roots growing down into that soil, helping create porosity so that we can create that sponge that we're trying to simulate in the landscape, to accept the water, get it into the soil profile, and then if we can get infiltration to happen, then that means our plants can actually have access to that water too. So a lot of good things coming from trying to increase vegetated cover anywhere possible, especially on our areas that are bare. And if we can't, if we don't have vegetation or something protecting that soil surface, a lot of the times that exposed soil, again, just from the energy of rainfall, raindrop impact, and then any overland flow will scour and erode that soil, carrying it into our local waterways. Sweeping grass clippings, fertilizers, any sort of loose soil off of hard surfaces. Again, these surfaces, every time it rains, whatever is on top of these surfaces will be carried off with the velocity of that runoff. And so again, having the potential and the risk for those substances to make its way into the storm drain system, and in turn making its way into our local creeks. So making sure that we're sweeping up after ourselves, not leaving any chemicals or other substances on those hard surfaces that could be transported during rainfall events. And into this last piece about washing your car. So consider washing your car on the lawn instead of in your driveway. So again, your soaps and your cleansers, they have different chemicals in them. So instead of washing your car on the hard surfaces where those soaps and cleansers and car grits could be washed in the storm drain, washing it on a permeable surface where that water can get into the soil, then it can trap all of those substances in the soil and kind of be remediated there naturally over time. Other oil, anything that's spilled from car maintenance activities, just making sure that you're using kitty litter or some other sorptive substance to try to get that off of the surface so that it's not carried away in that rainfall event would be another way to practice good housekeeping. And then finally, scooping the poop. So picking up your pet waste in the landscape, animal waste is a source of pathogens, and again, if it is carried away in stormwater runoff, can make its way to our surface waters through the storm drain system. So making sure that we are collecting our poop, especially scooping the poop, especially if it's on hard surfaces, and making sure that we've got our collection area where we're stockpiling that and how we're discarding that, making sure that we're not putting it in the flow path and right at the end of a downspout or some other place where water could take that away and run off. So in summary, these are your actions for reducing stormwater runoff and pollutants in the landscape. And each of these actions will help you accumulate inches towards your Tennessee Smart Yard. Our yard quality is a direct result of our actions, and our stream quality is a direct result of the community's actions. Because our landscape, we're all connected by water, and so the quality of that water and that stream is impacted by each and every one of us and how we select our actions and how we practice stewardship in our own landscapes. So again, this has been the module for reducing stormwater runoff and pollution in your home landscape, one of the 9 foundational principles towards a Tennessee Smart Yard. At 36 inches of actions, you can certify your Tennessee Smart Yard. Please visit this website to certify your Tennessee Smart Yard with us and receive this certificate in recognition of your accomplishment and your contribution to our Tennessee landscapes. So I'm Andrea Ludwig. Thank you for viewing this session, and please check our website for more sessions on how you can create a Tennessee Smart Yard. Thank you.